Have you ever felt invisible, like the world decided you weren't enough before you even had a chance to prove yourself? That's exactly what happened to Delilah James when she stepped off the train to meet her mail-order husband. At 43, she'd traveled hundreds of miles with hope in her heart, only to be rejected for being too curvy. The man took one look at her and walked away, leaving her standing there while everyone watched. Just when she was ready to give up and go home, a quiet mountain man named Eli stepped forward. He saw something beautiful in her that others had missed. What would happen when two people who'd been hurt by life found each other in the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered platform of Cedar Ridge Station as the westbound train released its final hiss of steam. Delilah James stood motionless beside her worn leather trunk, clutching a letter that had once held such promise. The paper, now damp with perspiration from her trembling hands, bore the careful script of a man who had courted her through correspondence for 8 months, a man who had just walked away without so much as a proper goodbye. At 43, Delilah had learned to read the subtle language of disappointment in people's faces, but nothing had prepared her for the cold assessment in Thomas Whitmore's eyes. He had looked her up and down like she was livestock at auction, his mouth twisting into a grimace before he muttered something about misrepresentation and not what was promised. The dozen onlookers townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrival of Cedar Ridge's newest mail-order bride now whispered among themselves, their voices carrying on the mountain breeze like autumn leaves. Her trunk sat heavy beside her, containing everything she owned in this world. 3 serviceable dresses she had sewn herself, her late mother's thimble and sewing box, a daguerreotype of her deceased husband William, and the small savings she had scraped together from 5 years of taking in mending and alterations in Philadelphia. Each item told the story of a woman who had learned to make do, to find beauty in simple things, and to never give up hope, even when hope seemed as fragile as morning frost. The journey west had taken 4 days, during which Delilah had rehearsed this meeting countless times. She had imagined Thomas would be pleased with her practical nature, her skill with needle and thread, her gentle way with children from her years helping in the church nursery. His letters had spoken of needing a sturdy woman who could handle the demands of frontier life, someone who wouldn't wilt at the first sign of hardship. She had believed herself to be exactly what he described. But sturdy, she now understood, was not the same as curved. Her full hips and ample bosom, which had never seemed shameful in her own mirror, had apparently failed some unspoken test. The realization settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Cedar Ridge itself was smaller than she had imagined. A collection of wooden buildings strung along the railroad tracks like beads on a rough thread. The general store stood opposite the station, its false front painted a cheerful yellow that seemed to mock her current circumstances. A saloon occupied the corner, its bat-winged doors releasing occasional bursts of laughter that sounded harsh to her ears. Beyond the main street, she could see modest houses scattered among the pine trees, smoke rising from their chimneys in the crisp mountain air. The Rocky Mountains rose around the town like ancient guardians, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the September warmth. Delilah had never seen such majesty, and for a moment her troubles faded as she marveled at the landscape. Back in Philadelphia, the tallest things she knew were church steeples and factory smokestacks. Here, the very earth seemed to reach toward heaven. "Next eastbound leaves tomorrow morning, miss." The station master's voice cut through her reverie. He was a kind-faced man with graying whiskers, and his tone held sympathy rather than judgment. "Ticket office opens at 7. Delilah nodded, not trusting her voice. Tomorrow morning would take her back to Philadelphia, back to her tiny rented room above Mrs. Place. Henderson's Bakery, back to the endless parade of torn hems and missing buttons that had been her life. The thought made her throat tight with unshed tears. "Might I suggest the hotel for tonight?" The station master gestured toward a 2-story building across the street, Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment, fair prices too." Before Delilah could respond, a shadow fell across the platform. She looked up to find a tall man approaching, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden planks. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, his broad shoulders filling out a worn flannel shirt. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hutta, simple gesture that somehow held more courtesy than all of Thomas Whitmore's flowery letters combined. "I'm Eli Boone. I couldn't help but notice you might be in need of assistance." His voice was low and measured, with a slight rasp that suggested he didn't use it often for lengthy conversations. There was something in his brown eyes, not pity, but a kind of understanding that made Delilah's chest tighten in an entirely different way. She cleared her throat, trying to find her composure. "I'm quite all right, thank you." But she wasn't all right, and they both knew it. Her hands were shaking, her carefully pinned hair had come loose during the journey, and her blue traveling dress was wrinkled from 4 days on the train. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman whose dreams had just crumbled like dry leaves. Eli glanced at the dispersing crowd, then back at her. "Tom Whitmore's got a reputation around here for being particular about things that don't matter much." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You deserve better than that kind of welcome to our town." The simple kindness in his words nearly undid her. Delilah blinked rapidly, determined not to cry in front of this stranger, no matter how gentle his manner. "I live up in the mountains," Eli continued, his voice remaining steady and calm. "Got a cabin about an hour's ride from here. Clean, quiet, and you'd be welcome to stay until you decide what you want to do next. No strings attached, just a roof over your head and decent food while you get your bearings." Delilah studied his face, searching for hidden motives or false promises. In Philadelphia, she had learned to be wary of men who offered help too freely. But there was something different about Eli Boone, a stillness about him that spoke of deep waters rather than shallow charm. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains that surrounded their small valley. "Sometimes folks need a place to catch their breath," he said finally. "I've got plenty of space and not much company. Seems like it might benefit us both." The station master had been listening to their exchange with obvious approval. "Eli's a good man, miss. Been living up there for near 5 years now. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's helped plenty of folks when they needed it." Delilah looked again at her trunk, at the ticket office that would take her back to everything she had tried to leave behind, at the mountains that promised something she couldn't yet name. Thomas Whitmore had seen her curves and found them wanting, but when Eli Boone looked at her, she didn't feel diminished. "I don't even know your name," Eli said gently. "Delilah James." The words came out stronger than she felt. "Well, Miss James, my offer stands. No pressure, no expectations, just a chance to rest and think things through without having to make any hasty decisions." The autumn sun was climbing higher now, warming the platform and casting the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the mountain thermals. Delilah closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the clean mountain air that was so different from the smoky atmosphere of Philadelphia. When she opened them again, Eli was still standing there patiently, his expression unchanged. He wasn't pressing her for an answer or trying to convince her with elaborate promises. He was simply offering what he had: shelter, safety, and time to heal. "All right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I accept your offer, Mr. Boone." He nodded once, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just Eli will do fine." He hefted her trunk easily, settling it on his broad shoulder. "My wagon's just around the corner. We'll get you settled, and you can rest while you decide what comes next." As they walked away from the station platform, Delilah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame that had formed when Thomas Whitmore looked right through her. Maybe she didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in hours, she felt like she was walking towards something rather than running away. The mountains stood silent and welcoming ahead, and beside her, Eli Boone moved with the quiet assurance of a man who kept his promises. Whatever came next, at least she wouldn't have to face it alone. Eli's wagon was a sturdy affair, built for mountain roads and heavy loads. The two horses, hitched to Eta Bay mare and a chestnut gelding, stood quietly as he secured Delilah's trunk in the back. Their calm demeanor spoke of animals well cared for and accustomed to their owner's gentle ways. "They're beautiful," Delilah said, running her hand along the mare's neck. The horse turned to nuzzle her palm, and she smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since stepping off the train. "That's Honey," Eli said, checking the harness one final time. "The gelding's buck. They know these mountain roads better than I do some days." He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch careful and respectful. "The trail gets steep in places, but they'll get us there safe." As they rolled out of Cedar Ridge, Delilah tried not to notice the faces that appeared in windows and doorways. News of her rejection had already spread through the small town like wildfire, and she could feel the weight of curious stares following their departure. Some faces showed sympathy, others mere curiosity, but all reminded her of how public her humiliation had been. "Don't mind them," Eli said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Small towns have long memories for gossip, but they're quick to find new things to talk about. Give it a week, and something else will catch their attention." The road began to climb almost immediately, winding through stands of pine and aspen that blazed gold in the morning sun. The air grew thinner and cleaner with each turn, carrying the scent of evergreen needles and wood smoke. Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew smaller until it looked like a child's toy set scattered in the valley below. "How long have you lived up here?" Delilah asked, settling into the rhythm of the wagon's movement. 5 years come November." Eli's voice held a note of something, not sadness exactly, but a weight that suggested those 5 years marked more than just time passing. "Built the cabin myself. Takes a while to get everything just right when you're working alone." Delilah sensed there was more to the story, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't ready to share it. Instead, she focused on the landscape unfolding around them. She had never imagined such vastness, such wild beauty. The mountains seemed to go on forever, ridge after ridge, stretching toward a horizon that promised endless possibilities. "It's magnificent," she breathed, and meant it. "I never knew places like this existed." Eli glanced at her, something like pleasure flickering in his brown eyes. "Most folks find it too quiet up here, too isolated." "I've spent the last 5 years listening to carriage wheels on cobblestones and factory whistles at dawn," Delilah replied. "Quiet sounds like a blessing." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of leather harness and the steady clip-clop of hooves on packed earth. Delilah found herself relaxing for the first time in days, the tension slowly leaving her shoulders as the peaceful surroundings worked their magic. "There," Eli said eventually, pointing to a break in the trees ahead. "That's home." Delilah followed his gaze and gasped. The cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, its log walls golden in the dappled sunlight. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and a wide porch wrapped around the front, complete with 2 handmade chairs that looked perfect for watching sunsets. Behind the main building, she could see a barn and what appeared to be a workshop, all constructed with the same careful craftsmanship. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, unable to hide her amazement. "Had plenty of time," Eli said simply, but she caught a note of pride in his voice. "Man needs something to keep his hands busy." As they drew closer, Delilah noticed the thoughtful, detail-scarved shutters on the windows, a garden plot with neat rows of late-season vegetables, split-rail fencing that followed the natural contours of the land. Everything spoke of a man who took care with his work, who built things to last. Eli helped her down from the wagon, and she stood for a moment, just taking it all in. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of her lonely room in Philadelphia. This was a living silence, filled with the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant call of some mountain bird. "It's perfect," she said softly. Something in her voice made Eli pause in the act of unhitching the horses. He looked at her, standing there in the dappled sunlight, her face turned up toward the mountains with an expression of wonder, and Delilah felt the strangest sensation, as if he was really seeing her for the first time. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff with some unnamed emotion. "Let's get you settled inside." The cabin's interior was as thoughtfully crafted as its exterior. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. Hand-hewn furniture filled the space, a dining table that could seat 6, chairs with rush seats, shelves lined with books. Everything was scrupulously clean and well-maintained, but there was a masculine spareness to it that spoke of a man living alone. "There's a bedroom back there you can use," Eli said, nodding toward a doorway hung with a simple curtain. "I'll sleep in the loft, ladders in the corner there." Delilah peeked into the bedroom and found a comfortable space with a real bed, not just a cot, but a proper bed with a feather mattress and handmade quilts. A small window looked out toward the mountains, and a washstand held a pitcher and basin of blue-painted ceramic. "This is your room," she protested, turning back to find Eli placing her trunk at the foot of the bed. "Was my room," he corrected gently, "but I built the loft to use eventually. Just never got around to moving my things up there until now." He paused, his hands resting on the trunk. "You'll be more comfortable down here, better for privacy too." The consideration in his gesture touched her deeply. Here was a man who thought of her comfort before his own, who was willing to disrupt his established patterns to make her feel welcome. "Eli," she began, then stopped, unsure how to express the gratitude that was filling her chest like warm honey. He seemed to understand anyway. "No need for thanks, Delilah. Just make yourself at home." The use of her first name sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. The way he said it, careful and respectful, as if he was tasting something precious, was so different from Thomas Whitmore's brisk formality. "I should start dinner," Eli continued, moving toward the kitchen area. "Nothing fancy, but I can promise it'll be filling." "Let me help," Delilah said quickly. "I'm a good cook, and I'd like to earn my keep." Eli paused, his hand resting on the handle of a cast-iron pot. "You don't need to earn anything. You're a guest here." "I'm a woman who's been taking care of herself for 5 years," Delilah replied with gentle firmness. "I'd feel better if I could contribute something useful." For a moment, they stood looking at each other across the rustic kitchen, and Delilah felt something pass between thema recognition, perhaps, of two people who understood the value of honest work and pulling one's own weight. "All right," Eli said finally, and she caught the hint of a smile. "But I warn you, I'm particular about my cooking." "So am I," Delilah replied, rolling up her sleeves. "I guess we'll see who's more stubborn." As they worked side by side, preparing the evening meal, Delilah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. Here, in this mountain cabin with a man she'd known for less than a day, she felt more at home than she had in her Philadelphia boarding house. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Through the kitchen window, she could see the peaceful scene, the horses grazing in their pasture, the garden with its neat rows, the workshop where Eli clearly spent many of his hours. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, not just a husband, but a life, a real life, in a place where the mountains touched the sky and a person could breathe freely. As Eli handed her a wooden spoon to stir the stew, their fingers brushed briefly. Neither of them pulled away immediately, and in that small moment of contact, Delilah felt a spark of something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the quiet, steady man who had offered her sanctuary when the world had turned its back. Maybe, just maybe, her journey west wasn't ending in disappointment after all. Maybe it was just beginning. The first morning at Eli's cabin dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows. Delilah woke to the sound of splitting wood and the low murmur of Eli's voice as he spoke to his horses. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before memory returned the train station, the rejection, and the quiet mountain man who had offered her sanctuary. She dressed quickly in her simplest brown wool dress and braided her hair into a practical style. Through her bedroom window, she could see Eli working at the woodpile, his breath forming small clouds in the mountain air. His movements were economical and sure, each swing of the axe finding its mark with practiced precision. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found the main room already warmed by a crackling fire. Coffee sat brewing on the stove, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Eli had left fresh biscuits wrapped in a clean towel on the table, along with a small crock of honey and another of preserves. "Good morning," she called toward the open door. Eli appeared in the doorway, carrying an armload of split wood. "Morning. Hope I didn't wake you with the chopping." "Not at all. I'm usually up with the sun, anyway." She poured herself coffee from the pot, inhaling the steam gratefully. "This smells wonderful." "Made it strong," Eli said, stacking the wood neatly beside the fireplace. "Mountain air has a way of making everything taste better, including coffee." As they shared a simple breakfast, Delilah found herself studying the details of the cabin she had missed in yesterday's emotional haze. The walls were chinked perfectly, keeping out drafts that would have made a lesser-built structure miserable in winter. The furniture was all handmade, but showed real craftsmanship joints, fitted precisely, surfaces sanded smooth as silk. "You're quite the craftsman," she observed, running her finger along the edge of the table. "Did you learn woodworking before you came here?" Eli's hands stilled on his coffee cup. "Some. Had plenty of time to improve once I settled up here." He paused, then added quietly, "A man needs something to keep his mind occupied." There was that weight in his voice again, the suggestion of stories he wasn't ready to tell. Delilah recognized the tone she had used it herself when people asked about her late husband or why she had no children. "Well, whatever drove you to it, you have a real gift," she said gently. "Everything here feels so solid and well-made." A flush of pleasure colored Eli's weathered cheeks. "Thank you. That means something, coming from someone who clearly knows quality work herself." He nodded toward her dress. "That's fine stitching. You do that yourself?" Delilah smoothed the fabric self-consciously. "I was a seamstress back in Philadelphia. Did alterations and mending mostly, but I made all my own clothes." She gestured toward the simple dress. "Nothing fancy, but it wears well." "Practical and beautiful," Eli said, then seemed to realize what he had said. He cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "I should show you around the place, help you get your bearings." They spent the morning touring Eli's domain, and with each stop, Delilah's admiration grew. The barn was as carefully constructed as the cabin, with stalls for 4 horses, though only 2 were currently in residence. The hayloft above was filled with sweet-smelling grass, and every tool had its proper place on the walls. "You keep everything so organized," Delilah marveled. "Have to, when you're living alone," Eli replied. "Can't afford to waste time hunting for things when the weather turns bad." The workshop behind the barn proved to be Eli's pride and joy. Workbenches lined the walls, fitted with vises and tool racks that held everything from delicate carving knives to massive cross-cut saws. Half-finished furniture pieces occupied every available space: a rocking chair that needed only its final sanding, a chest with intricate carved panels, a set of kitchen chairs that would grace any home. "Do you sell these?" Delilah asked, running her hand over the smooth arm of the rocking chair. "Some. The general store in Cedar Ridge takes a few pieces, and sometimes folks place special orders." Eli picked up a piece of sandpaper and absently began smoothing a rough spot on the chair arm. "Keeps me in supplies, and gives me something useful to do with my time." Delilah examined the carved chest more closely, tracing the delicate pattern of vines and leaves with her fingertip. "This is museum quality. You could charge real money for work like this." Eli shrugged, but she caught the pleased expression that crossed his face. "Never thought much about it. Just do what feels right." "That's exactly the problem," Delilah said, warming to the subject. "You're undervaluing your work. I bet people would pay good money for furniture like this if they knew about it." "How would you know what people would pay for?" The question came out more sharply than Eli had intended, and he immediately looked apologetic. Delilah wasn't offended. She had heard that tone before from craftsmen who had been told their work wasn't worth much. Because I spent 5 years watching wealthy Philadelphia ladies pay ridiculous prices for furniture half as well made as yours. The difference is, theirs came with fancy names and polished salesmen. She moved to the set of kitchen chairs, testing the joints and examining the finish. These are perfect, every joint tight, every surface smooth. I've seen chairs like these selling for $20 a piece in the fancy stores. Eli's eyebrows rose. $20? For a chair? For a well-made chair, yes. The problem is, you're hidden up here where no one can see your work. What you need is someone to handle the business side correspondence, orders, that sort of thing. The suggestion hung in the air between them, and Delilah realized she was essentially offering to involve herself in his life in a permanent way. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it felt natural, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "I couldn't ask you to," Eli began. "You're not asking, I'm offering." Delilah met his eyes steadily. "I'm good with letters and numbers, and I know quality when I see it. If you're willing to trust me, I think we could build something here." The word "we" seemed to echo in the workshop. Eli set down his sandpaper and looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Why would you want to do that?" he asked finally. Delilah considered her answer carefully. She could tell him about her need to feel useful, about her gratitude for his kindness, about her desire to contribute something meaningful. All of those would be true. But the deeper truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. "Because I think we could help each other," she said quietly. "You have skills that aren't being properly valued, and I have skills that could help fix that. And because," she paused, gathering courage, "because I feel more at home here in 2 days than I did in 5 years in Philadelphia." Eli's expression softened. "And if Tom Whitmore had been what you expected? If things had worked out different?" Delilah thought about that, about the life she had imagined with a man who could reject her so casually. "Then I would have missed this," she said simply, "and that would have been a real shame." For a moment, the only sound in the workshop was the distant whistle of wind through the pines. Then Eli nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We can try it, see how it works out." "We can try it," Delilah agreed, and felt something warm and hopeful unfurl in her chest, like the first flowers of spring. By the end of her first week at the cabin, Delilah had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She rose early to help with breakfast, spent her mornings organizing Eli's business correspondence, what little there was, and her afternoons working on a quilt she had begun with fabric scraps from her sewing box. The evenings were spent by the fire, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in gentle conversation that revealed new layers to both their characters. Eli proved to be a thoughtful companion, neither overwhelming her with attention nor treating her like an unwelcome burden. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged gradually, like sun breaking through morning clouds, and a way of listening that made her feel heard in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "I wrote to the furniture maker in Denver," Delilah said one morning, showing him the carefully penned letter. "I described your work, the craftsmanship, the materials you use, the attention to detail. I think he might be interested in placing an order." Eli read through her letter, his eyebrows rising as he took in her professional tone and business language. "You make it sound like I'm some kind of master craftsman." "You are," Delilah said firmly. "You just don't know it yet." 3 days later, when they made their first trip to town together for supplies, Delilah's confidence in her assessment was put to the test. She had been dreading this moment, the inevitable confrontation with the curious stares and whispered comments of Cedar Ridge's residents. The town looked different to her now, smaller somehow, as if the mountain perspective had changed how she saw things. Eli drove the wagon directly to Harrison's general store, where he conducted his usual business with quiet efficiency. But Delilah couldn't help noticing the sideways glances from other customers, the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. "That's her," she heard Mrs. Abernathy whisper to her companion near the fabric counter. "The one Tom Whitmore sent packing, living up at Eli Boone's place now, if you can believe it." Shameful, came the reply. A decent woman wouldn't put herself in such a position. The words hit Delilah like physical blows, bringing back all the shame and embarrassment from that first day. She focused intently on the list Eli had given her, trying to ignore the burning in her cheeks. Delilah. Eli's voice appeared at her elbow, low and steady. You about ready to head back? She nodded, not trusting her voice. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, she was acutely aware of the eyes watching from storefront windows and doorways. The scrutiny felt suffocating after the peace of the mountains. Don't let them get to you, Eli said quietly as they drove out of town. Small minds make small talk. It's different for me than it is for you, Delilah replied, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. A woman's reputation. Your reputation is your own to make, Eli interrupted gently, and anyone with sense can see you're a good woman. Can they? The question came out sharper than she intended, because what they see is a rejected mail-order bride living unchaperoned with a bachelor. They're already drawing their conclusions. Eli was quiet for several minutes, the only sound the steady clip-clop of the horses and the creak of wagon wheels. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Then maybe we should give them something else to talk about. Delilah looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? I mean, maybe it's time I started acting less like a hermit and more like a member of this community. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There's a church social next Saturday. Harvest celebration. I haven't been to one in a long time, but if you'd like to go, I'd be honored to escort you. The offer caught Delilah completely off guard. A church social meant facing the entire community, subjecting herself to their judgment and gossip. But it also meant standing beside Eli as his chosen companion, meeting their speculation head-on, rather than hiding from it. You don't have to do that, she said softly. I know you prefer your privacy. I do, Eli admitted, but I also know that hiding up on the mountain isn't going to help either of us in the long run. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I'm curious to see what you think of Reverend Morrison's apple cider. He's mighty proud of his recipe. That evening, as Delilah worked on her quilt by lamplight, she found herself thinking about Eli's offer. The fabric pieces in her hands, blues and browns and warm golds, were coming together to form a pattern called wedding ring, though she had chosen it more for its beauty than its symbolism. Now, as she carefully stitched the interlocking circles, she wondered if the design had been prophetic. That's coming along nicely, Eli said, looking up from the book he was reading. My grandmother used to quilt. Never seen anyone work as neat as you do, though. It helps me think, Delilah replied, smoothing the fabric with her palm. There's something soothing about making something beautiful from scraps. Is that what you're doing here? Eli asked quietly, making something beautiful from scraps. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings neither was quite ready to explore. Delilah felt her pulse quicken as she met his gaze across the firelit room. Maybe, she said honestly. Are you? Instead of answering directly, Eli marked his place in his book and set it aside. Delilah, I want you to know, whatever happens, however long you decide to stay, you're welcome here. Not as a guest, not as someone earning her keep, but as, he paused, searching for words, as someone who belongs. The simple statement made her throat tight with emotion. Belonging was something she had almost stopped believing in, a luxury she had convinced herself she could live without. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than you know. They sat in comfortable silence after that, the only sounds the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant call of an owl in the pines. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that were growing deeper and more complex with each passing day. When Delilah finally retreated to her bedroom, she found herself standing at the window, looking out at the star-filled sky that seemed so much brighter here than it ever had in the city. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the soft sounds of Eli moving about the cabin, banking the fire and preparing for the night. For the first time since William's death, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Whatever challenges the church social might bring, whatever gossip the townspeople might spread, she would face it standing beside a man who saw her worth when others saw only her flaws. As she prepared for bed, Delilah caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her seemed different, somehow less anxious, more centered. The mountain air had brought color to her cheeks, and there was a light in her eyes that had been missing for too long. Maybe Eli was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start living. The church social proved to be both an ordeal and a revelation. Delilah dressed carefully in her best blue dress, the one she had worn for traveling, and braided her hair into an elegant arrangement that she hoped struck the right balance between respectability and attractiveness. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found Eli waiting by the door in clean clothes and polished boots, his hair still damp from washing. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the quiet sincerity in his voice made her feel more confident than all the elaborate compliments she had received in her younger days. The ride to town was pleasant, with October's golden light filtering through the aspens and painting the world in shades of amber and rust. But as they approached the church, Delilah's stomach began to flutter with nervousness. She could see other wagons and buggies gathered around the small white building, could hear the sound of voices and laughter carrying on the crisp air. "Second thoughts?" Eli asked, noticing her sudden stillness. "Third and fourth thoughts," Delilah admitted, "but I suppose we've come this far." Eli helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady and warm on her waist. "Just remember," he said quietly, "we're not here to prove anything to anyone. We're here because we want to be." The social was being held in the church hall, a simple room decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming flowers. Tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes, apple pies and cornbread, roasted chicken and pickled vegetables. The air was filled with the warmth of good food and community fellowship. For the first few minutes, Delilah was acutely aware of the conversations that stopped when she passed, the curious glances that followed her movements. But gradually, as neighbors greeted Eli with genuine warmth and included her in their welcomes, she began to relax. "Miss James," said a voice behind her. She turned to find a young woman with kind eyes and flour still dusting her apron. "I'm Sarah Morrison, the Reverend's daughter. I wanted to thank you for coming tonight." "Thank you for having me," Delilah replied, surprised by the genuine warmth in the woman's voice. "I also wanted to say," Sarah glanced around, then leaned closer, "I think what Tom Whitmore did to you was shameful. Any man who would judge a woman so harshly based on appearances isn't worthy of her in the first place." The unexpected support brought tears to Delilah's eyes. "That's very kind of you to say. It's only the truth, and I can see why Eli enjoys your company. He seems different these days, lighter somehow. We've all been worried about him, living up there alone for so long." Before Delilah could ask what she meant, Sarah was called away to help serve the cider. But her words lingered, adding another piece to the puzzle of Eli's past that Delilah was slowly assembling. As the evening progressed, she found herself genuinely enjoying the company. The Reverend proved to be a jovial man with a talent for storytelling, and his apple cider was indeed worthy of praise. Several women complimented her dress and asked about her needlework, leading to animated discussions about patterns and techniques. But it was watching Eli that proved most interesting. Away from his mountain sanctuary, she could see how naturally he fit into the community, despite his years of self-imposed isolation. Men sought his advice on practical matters, children gravitated toward his quiet presence, and older women clearly considered him a prize catch who had been hidden away too long. "That's some fine furniture work you've been doing, Eli," said Mr. Patterson from the hotel. "My wife's been admiring that table you made for the Hendersons. You think you might have time for a commission?" "Depends on what you're looking for," Eli replied, glancing at Delilah. "My partner handles the business arrangements these days." The word partner sent a warm thrill through Delilah's chest. It was the first time he had referred to her that way publicly, and she could see the effect it had on the listening crowd. Partnership implied permanence, mutual respect, things that elevated their arrangement beyond mere charity or convenience. Later, as they walked outside for some fresh air, Delilah found herself curious about the gaps in Eli's story that the evening had highlighted. Sarah Morrison said you seemed different lately, she said as they stood under the star-filled sky. Different how? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. I suppose I've been closed off for a while. Had my reasons. What reasons? The question came out more directly than she had intended, but she was tired of dancing around the edges of his past. Eli looked at her then, his expression serious in the moonlight. I was married before, had a family. The simple statement hit Delilah like a physical blow. Of course, he had been married. A man like Eli wouldn't have lived 50 years without someone recognizing his worth. But hearing it confirmed made her chest tight with something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. What happened? She asked quietly. Fever took them. My wife Anna and our daughter Mary. She was only 6. His voice was steady, but Delilah could hear the carefully controlled pain beneath the words. That was 5 years ago. Couldn't stay in the house where they'd lived, so I came up here. Built something new. Understanding flooded through Delilah like a tide. The careful way he had given her the bedroom, sleeping in the loft himself. The books on the shelves that included children's stories alongside practical manuals. The extra care he took with everything, as if building a perfect world could somehow atone for the one he had lost. I'm so sorry, she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. It was a long time ago, Eli said, but she could tell from his tone that time hadn't diminished the wound as much as he wanted to believe. Is that why you helped me? Because you know what it feels like to lose everything? Eli turned to face her fully, his eyes serious in the starlight. Maybe partly, but mostly because when I looked at you standing there with your trunk and your pride and your broken dreams, I saw someone worth helping, someone who deserved better than what life had handed her. The honesty in his voice made Delilah's throat tight with emotion. And now, what do you see now? Now I see someone who's become part of my life in ways I didn't expect, he said quietly. Someone who makes me remember what it feels like to hope for things again. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Delilah felt her heart racing, aware that they were approaching territory that would change everything between them. Eli, she began, but he shook his head gently. I know it's complicated. I know you came here looking for something different, and I don't want to presume. You're not presuming, Delilah interrupted softly. You're exactly what I was looking for. I just didn't know it at the time. For a moment, they stood in perfect stillness, the space between them charged with possibility. Then, from inside the church hall, came the sound of fiddle music starting up for dancing, and the spell was gently broken. We should go back, Eli said, though he made no move to leave. Yes, Delilah agreed, not moving either. But eventually, they did return to the warmth and light of the social, and if their hands brushed more often as the evening continued, if their glances held a new awareness, neither commented on it directly. Some things, Delilah thought, were better allowed to develop naturally, like the trust that had grown between them day by day in the peaceful sanctuary of the mountains. October gave way to November with a swiftness that caught Delilah by surprise. The aspens shed their golden leaves in great drifts that crunched underfoot, and frost began appearing regularly on the cabin windows. Each morning brought the promise of winter's approach, and with it, a subtle shift in the rhythm of life at the mountain cabin. Eli began spending longer hours in his workshop, preparing for the months when outdoor work would be impossible. The orders Delilah had generated were keeping him busier than he had been in years 3. Dining sets for Denver families, a rocking chair for a new mother in Colorado Springs, and a handsome desk commissioned by the bank in Cedar Ridge. I never imagined there would be this much interest, Eli said one evening, reviewing the correspondence that had accumulated. At this rate, I'll be working straight through till spring. Good problems to have, Delilah replied, looking up from her mending. She had taken over the task of keeping their clothes in good repair, finding satisfaction in the way neat stitches could restore both function and beauty to worn garments. Though I worry you're pushing yourself too hard. It was true. Eli rose before dawn and often worked by lamplight well into the evening. The increased productivity was gratifying, But Delilah noticed the tired lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there when she first arrived. "Winter's coming," he said simply. "Need to make the most of the working time I have left." The approaching season brought practical concerns as well. Delilah had been at the cabin for nearly 2 months, and her presence had shifted from temporary refuge to something more permanent. But neither of them had spoken directly about what would happen when the snows came in earnest, when travel to and from the mountain would become difficult, if not impossible. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Eli finally broached the subject that had been hovering between them like morning mist. "Delilah," he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." She set aside her sewing, giving him her full attention. "Of course. Are you staying because you want to, or because you feel like you don't have anywhere else to go?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. She had been expecting him to ask about winter arrangements, about practical matters of food and fuel and sleeping arrangements when the temperature dropped below freezing for weeks at a time. "Why do you ask?" Eli stood and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit peaks. "Because if you're only here because you feel trapped by circumstances, then we need to make other arrangements before the passes close. I won't have you feeling like a prisoner up here." The word prisoner stung more than it should have. Was that how he saw her presences, an obligation he had taken on out of misguided charity? "Is that what you think?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. "That I'm here because I have nowhere else to go?" "I think," Eli said carefully, not turning from the window, "that you came here hurt and desperate, and I offered you shelter. But shelter and wanting to stay are 2 different things." Delilah stood as well, moving to face him across the small room. "You're right, they are different things, and you deserve to know which one this is." She took a deep breath, knowing that what she said next would determine the course of both their lives. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought I was looking for a husband, someone to take care of me, to give me a place in the world that made sense." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But what I really wanted was to belong somewhere, to feel like my life had meaning beyond just surviving from one day to the next." Eli turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "I've found that here," Delilah continued, "not because you rescued me from an embarrassing situation, but because what we've built together feels real, important. I wake up every morning knowing that my work matters, that my presence makes a difference. That's not something I'm willing to give up lightly." "And when the snows come?" Eli asked quietly. "When we're snowed in together for months at a time, when there's no escaping to town, no privacy, no way to maintain the polite distance we've been keeping." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had been willing to address directly. Living in close quarters through a mountain winter would test any relationship, but for 2 people fighting a growing attraction while maintaining the fiction of mere partnership, it could prove impossible. "I've thought about that," Delilah admitted. "Have you?" Instead of answering, Eli moved to the mantel and picked up something that had been sitting there so long. Delilah had stopped noticing it, a small wooden box, worn smooth by handling. He opened it and withdrew a gold ring, simple and elegant in its simplicity. "This was Anna's," he said quietly, holding it up to catch the firelight. "I've been carrying it around for 5 years, unable to put it away, but unable to move forward while I kept it." Delilah's breath caught in her throat as understanding dawned. "Yesterday I put it in this box," Eli continued. "Not because I love her memory any less, but because carrying it with me was keeping me from living, from seeing what was right in front of me." He closed the box and set it back on the mantel, then turned to face her fully. "I'm not asking you to stay just because winter's coming. I'm asking you to stay because I love you. Because somewhere in the last 2 months, you stopped being a guest in my house and started being the reason I look forward to coming home each night." The words hit Delilah with the force of an avalanche. Love. He had said it simply, directly, without embellishment or apology. The honesty of it took her breath away. "Eli," she began, but he held up a hand. "I know it's not what you planned. I know you didn't come here looking for a grieving widower with more baggage than belongings. But if there's any chance that what's grown between us is real for you too, then I'm asking you to stay. Not as my guest, not as my business partner, but as my wife." The proposal hung in the air between them, simple and profound. No flowery speeches, no grand gestures, just an honest man offering his heart to a woman who had somehow become essential to his happiness. Delilah looked at him standing there in the firelight, this quiet, steady man who had seen her worth when others had seen only her flaws, who had given her shelter, then partnership, then love, without asking for anything in return except her authentic self. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you. And yes, I love you too." The smile that spread across Eli's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "I was afraid you'd say no," he murmured against her hair. "Afraid I was presuming too much." "You were presuming exactly the right amount," Delilah replied, breathing in the familiar scent of wood shavings and mountain air that had become synonymous with home. "Though I have to scare you prepared for the scandal this will cause in town." Eli pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with laughter. "Let them talk. We'll be too busy being happy to notice." And for the first time since stepping off that train in Cedar Ridge, Delilah truly believed that happiness was not only possible, but inevitable. The morning after Eli's proposal dawned crisp and clear, with the promise of winter hanging in the air like an unspoken blessing. Delilah woke with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years, the weight of uncertainty finally lifted from her shoulders. She was going to marry Eli Boone, and the knowledge filled her with a joy so pure it felt almost dangerous. They had decided to travel to town that day to speak with Reverend Morrison about arranging a simple ceremony. Nothing elaborate, just the two of them, a few witnesses, and the promises that would bind their lives together, legally as well as emotionally. "Ready for more gossip?" Eli asked, as he helped her into the wagon, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor. "Let them talk," Delilah replied, echoing his words from the night before. "We know what's true." The ride to Cedar Ridge was peaceful, with autumn's last breath painting the world in shades of rust and gold. They spoke quietly of practical matters: when to hold the ceremony, whether to send word to Delilah's few remaining relatives in Philadelphia, how to arrange their affairs to reflect their new partnership in all things. But as they rounded the bend that brought the town into view, Delilah noticed a commotion near the train station. Several men in dark suits stood clustered around a pile of luggage, their city clothes marking them as strangers in the small mountain community. "Wonder what that's about," Eli murmured, guiding the wagon toward the general store. They found out soon enough. Before they had even finished securing the horses, Mr. Patterson from the hotel approached them with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Eli, Miss James," he called out, slightly out of breath. "You'll want to know there's a lawyer in town asking questions about you, miss. Came in on the morning train with papers and such." Delilah felt her stomach drop like a stone. "A lawyer? What kind of questions?" "Legal business, from what I could gather. Something about breach of contract and misrepresentation." Patterson's eyes were bright with curiosity. "He's been asking around about your arrangement with Tom Whitmore, and now about your current situation." Before Delilah could respond, one of the dark-suited men detached himself from the group near the station and approached their wagon. He was a thin, sharp-featured man with pale eyes and an air of officious authority that immediately put Delilah on edge. "Miss Delilah James?" he inquired, removing his hat with perfunctory politeness. "Yes," Delilah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, attorney at law, representing Mr. Thomas Whitmore in a matter of legal significance." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "I am here to serve you with notice of a civil action for breach of contract, fraud, and damages resulting from your willful misrepresentation in the matter of your mail-order bride arrangement." The words hit Delilah like physical blows. Around them, she was dimly aware of townspeople gathering, drawn by the drama unfolding in their midst. Beside her, she felt Eli tense, his hand moving protectively to her arm. "Misrepresentation," Delilah managed to say. "What misrepresentation?" Blackwood consulted his papers with theatrical precision. "My client alleges that you knowingly presented yourself falsely in your correspondence, failing to accurately describe your physical appearance and thereby defrauding him of the considerable expense he incurred in arranging your transportation and intended marriage." "She described herself honestly," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. "If your client had expectations that weren't met, that's his failing, not hers." Blackwood barely glanced at Eli. "Furthermore, my client seeks damages for the public humiliation he suffered when forced to reject an unsuitable bride, as well as compensation for travel expenses, lodging, and emotional distress." "Emotional distress?" Delilah's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "He humiliated me in front of the entire town. My client was the injured party in this matter," Blackwood replied coolly. "A man has the right to expect honesty in such arrangements. When that honesty is not forthcoming, the law provides remedies." He held out the papers with the satisfied air of a man who believed himself to be entirely in the right. "You are hereby summoned to appear before Judge Harrison in Denver within 30 days to answer these charges. Failure to appear will result in a default judgment against you." Delilah's hands shook as she took the papers, the legal language blurring before her eyes. Words like fraud and damages and willful deception seemed to jump off the page, each one a fresh wound to her already battered sense of self-worth. "There's more," Blackwood continued, his tone growing even more self-satisfied. "My investigation has revealed that you are currently living unmarried with Mr. Boone here, which only reinforces my client's contention that you are a woman of questionable moral character who entered into your original agreement under false pretenses." The accusation hung in the air like poison smoke. Delilah felt every eye in the gathered crowd boring into her, every whispered conversation from the past 2 months crystallizing into public condemnation. The happiness of the morning felt like a lifetime ago. "That's enough," Eli said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the calm surface. "You've delivered your papers. Now you can leave." "Actually, I cannot," Blackwood replied with obvious pleasure. "You see, I've discovered some very interesting information about Mr. Whitmore's business practices that I believe the good people of Cedar Ridge should know about." He turned to address the growing crowd directly, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced orator. "It seems my client has a rather extensive history with mail-order bride arrangements. This is, in fact, the 7th such case he has initiated in the past 2 years alone." A murmur ran through the crowd at this revelation. Delilah looked up sharply, hope flickering in her chest despite the legal papers clutched in her hands. 7 women, Blackwood continued, all rejected for various perceived inadequacies, all subsequently sued for fraud and breach of contract. It appears to be quite a profitable enterprise for Mr. Whitmore, particularly when the women in question lack the resources to mount an adequate legal defense. The murmur from the crowd grew louder, taking on an angry edge. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery pushed forward, her usually gentle face flushed with indignation. "You mean to say this Whitmore fellow has been swindling women deliberately?" she demanded. "I mean to say," Blackwood replied with satisfaction, "that my client has found a very clever way to profit from women's desperation and society's willingness to blame them for their own victimization." Delilah stared at the lawyer in confusion. "But you're representing him. Why are you telling us this?" Blackwood's thin smile took on a predatory quality. "Because, my dear Miss James, Mr. Whitmore made a critical error when he chose his latest target. You see, I am not actually here representing him. I am here representing the interests of justice and of 6 other women who have finally found the courage to band together and expose his fraudulent scheme." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Delilah felt the world spinning around her as the full implications sank in. "Then these papers are quite real, I'm afraid. Mr. Whitmore did indeed file suit against you, just as he did against the others. But what he doesn't know is that his previous victims have been comparing notes, and they've discovered a pattern that even the law cannot ignore. Blackwood reached into his coat again and withdrew a different set of papers. I am also here to serve Mr. Whitmore with a countersuit for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to defraud. It seems his mail-order bride business was never about finding wives at all, it was about finding victims. The crowd erupted in angry voices, the good people of Cedar Ridge finally understanding the true nature of what had happened to Delilah. But she barely heard them, her mind reeling with the implications of Blackwood's revelation. "What does this mean for me?" she asked quietly. "It means, Miss James, that you have a choice," Blackwood replied, his tone gentling slightly. "You can fight these charges in court alongside the other women, helping to expose Mr. Whitmore's crimes and seeking justice, not just for yourself, but for all his victims. Or you can settle quietly and let him continue preying on others." Delilah looked at Eli, seeing her own determination reflected in his steady gaze. Around them, the townspeople who had whispered about her were now loudly declaring their support, their earlier judgment transformed into protective indignation. "I'll fight," she said firmly, "not just for myself, but for every woman he's hurt." Blackwood nodded approvingly. "I hoped you would say that, because, Miss James, you may be the key to bringing down one of the most sophisticated marriage fraud schemes I've ever encountered. And that, I believe, would be justice worth fighting for." The next week passed in a whirlwind of preparation that transformed their quiet mountain sanctuary into something resembling a war room. Blackwood had established temporary quarters at Patterson's Hotel, and each day brought new revelations about the scope of Thomas Whitmore's fraudulent enterprise. "Look at this," Delilah said one morning, spreading documents across Eli's dining table. "Martha Simmons from Kansas, Rebecca Foster from Ohio, Catherine Williams from Illinois, all rejected for the same reasons I was. Too old, too heavy, not what was promised." Eli studied the papers over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he read the familiar patterns of humiliation and legal intimidation. "How did they find each other?" Martha placed an advertisement in a women's periodical asking if anyone else had experienced similar treatment. Delilah explained. The responses started coming in within weeks. Apparently, Whitmore has been running this scheme across multiple states, always choosing women who seemed unlikely to have the resources to fight back. But Whitmore had underestimated the power of desperate women who had finally found each other. The evidence they had compiled was Dominguez's systematic pattern of false advertising, deliberate rejection, and subsequent legal harassment designed to extract money from women who could least afford to lose it. "The trial is set for next Monday," Blackwood announced during one of his daily visits to the cabin. "Judge Morrison has agreed to consolidate all 7 cases into a single hearing. Unusual, but then this is an unusual situation." Delilah looked up from the correspondence she was organizing. "Will the other women be there?" 3 of them are traveling to Denver for the hearing. The others will testify by sworn affidavit." Blackwood's expression was grimly satisfied. "Between their testimony and the documentary evidence we've compiled, I believe we have an excellent chance of not only defeating Whitmore's claims, but seeing him face criminal charges." The thought of facing Whitmore again in a courtroom filled Delilah with a mixture of dread and determination. She had spent 2 months building a new life, finding love and purpose in the mountains with Eli. Now she would have to relive the humiliation of that first day, this time in front of a judge and jury who would decide whether her pain was legally justified. "I keep thinking about what I should have done differently," she confessed to Eli one evening as they sat by the fire. "Maybe if I had been more explicit in my letters about my appearance, if I had sent a photograph." "Stop," Eli interrupted gently but firmly. "You did nothing wrong. You described yourself honestly, 43-year-old widow with practical skills and a good heart. If that wasn't enough for him, he should have said so before putting you through the expense and humiliation of traveling west. But the law is supposed to protect people from being victimized, not provide tools for victimizers to profit from their cruelty." Eli reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Blackwood seems confident, and the evidence is strong. You're not fighting this alone." The truth of his words became evident over the following days as support arrived from unexpected quarters. Sarah Morrison organized the church ladies to write character references for Delilah. Mr. Patterson offered to testify about Whitmore's behavior during his brief stay at the hotel. Even Mrs. Abernathy, who had been among the most vocal critics of Delilah's living arrangements, came forward with an apology and an offer to help however she could. "I misjudged you," the older woman said stiffly, standing in the cabin's main room with her hat in her hands. "What that man did was wrong, and what he's trying to do now is worse. You have my support and my testimony if you need it." But perhaps the most significant support came from an unexpected source. On Friday morning, 3 days before the trial, a woman arrived at the cabin accompanied by Blackwood. She was perhaps 35, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that held the same mixture of pain and determination Delilah recognized in her own mirror. "Miss James," Blackwood said, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Martha Simmons, the woman who started this whole investigation." Martha stepped forward, extending her hand with a firm grip. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your case was the one that finally convinced me we had enough evidence to fight back." "My case, but yours came first." "Yes, but mine was in Kansas, under different jurisdiction. When Blackwood told me about a recent case in Colorado with the same pattern, I knew we had him. Interstate fraud is a federal matter, which means federal prosecution." They spent the morning reviewing strategy and testimony, Martha sharing her experience of the legal process and offering practical advice about facing Whitmore in court. But it was her story that proved most illuminating. "I was a teacher in Topeka," Martha explained. "Lost my position when the school board decided they preferred younger instructors. I had some savings, but not enough to live on indefinitely. The mail-order bride arrangement seemed like a practical solution marriage to a Colorado rancher who needed a wife to help run his household." "What happened when you met him?" Delilah asked. Martha's expression hardened. "Same thing that happened to you. One look and he declared I was not as described. But I got suspicious when I overheard him talking to another man about the business and how profitable it was becoming. I started asking questions around town and discovered he'd done the same thing to at least 2 other women in the past year." "So you decided to investigate?" "I decided to fight back, but it took finding the others to realize how extensive his operation really was." Martha pulled out a notebook filled with careful handwriting. 7 women across 4 states, all following the same pattern. "It's not about marriage at all, it's about finding women desperate enough to pay their own way west, then extracting money from them through legal intimidation." The scope of Whitmore's deception was staggering. He had turned the mail-order bride system, already fraught with potential for abuse, into a sophisticated confidence game that preyed on women's hopes and society's willingness to blame them for their own victimization. "What about the other women?" Delilah asked. "The ones who can't travel to Denver?" "They'll be represented by their sworn statements," Blackwood replied. "But your testimony will be crucial, Miss James, because your case is the most recent and the most thoroughly documented. Also," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "your current circumstances provide a compelling counter-narrative to Whitmore's claims about your character." Delilah understood. Her engagement to Eli, their successful business partnership, the respect she had earned in the community, all of it served as evidence that Whitmore's rejection had been arbitrary and cruel, rather than justified by any genuine inadequacy on her part. "Are you ready for this?" Eli asked that evening as they prepared for the journey to Denver. They would leave at dawn on Saturday, giving them time to settle in before the Monday hearing. Delilah considered the question seriously. Was she ready to face the man who had humiliated her so publicly, ready to have her most private pain dissected in a courtroom? Ready to risk everything on the chance that justice might actually prevail? "I'm ready," she said finally. "Not because I'm not afraid, but because this is bigger than what happened to me. If we can stop him from hurting other women, then everything I went through will have meant something." Eli nodded, pulling her close. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, remember that you're not the same woman who stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge. You're stronger now, and you're not facing this alone. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, dusting the mountains with white and signaling the approach of winter. But for the first time since receiving those legal papers, Delilah felt warm with more than just the fire crackling in the hearth. She was fighting for more than just her own vindication now. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough, every woman who had been blamed for someone else's cruelty, every woman who had been made to feel ashamed of hoping for love and happiness. Monday would bring the trial, and with it the chance to turn her private pain into public justice. As she packed her few belongings for the journey to Denver, Delilah found herself thinking not about what she might lose, but about what she had already gained: love, purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that her worth was not determined by the cruel judgment of men like Thomas Whitmore. The mountains stood silent and strong around their cabin, promising that whatever the outcome in Denver, she would always have a home to return to. And beside her, Eli moved with the quiet confidence of a man prepared to stand by her side, no matter what storms lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning Thomas Whitmore had never expected when he targeted a desperate widow from Philadelphia. But tonight, she was simply Delilah James, beloved and valued, preparing to fight for justice with the full strength of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. The Denver courthouse stood like a fortress of justice against the morning sky, its imposing stone facade somehow both intimidating and reassuring. Delilah stood at its base, her hand tucked securely in Eli's arm, watching other people climb the wide steps toward their own encounters with the law. "Remember," Blackwood said quietly beside them, "stick to the facts. Tell your story simply and honestly. Don't let Whitmore's attorney try to make you angry or defensive." Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Delilah had imagined, but no less imposing. Dark wood paneling rose to a coffered ceiling, and tall windows let in streams of autumn light that illuminated the space where her fate would be decided. The judge's bench loomed at the front, flanked by the American flag and the Colorado state banner. Thomas Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a heavy-set man with an aggressive demeanor who kept shuffling through papers and whispering urgently to his client. Whitmore himself looked exactly as Delilah remembered, well-dressed, self-important, with the kind of cold eyes that could dismiss a person's worth in a single glance. When those eyes met hers across the courtroom, Delilah felt a familiar flutter of shame try to rise in her chest. But this time, instead of looking away, she held his gaze steadily, until he was the one who turned aside. She was not the same broken woman he had rejected 2 months ago. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom rustled to its feet. Judge Harrison proved to be a stern-faced man in his 60s, with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes. He settled behind his bench with the efficiency of someone accustomed to cutting through legal nonsense to reach the truth. "This is an unusual case," he began, scanning the assembled parties. "We have what appears to be a simple breach of contract suit that has evolved into allegations of systematic fraud. Garrett, as counsel for the plaintiff, you may present your opening statement." Whitmore's attorney rose with theatrical flourish. "Your Honor, my client is a hard-working businessman who sought a wife through legitimate mail-order bride arrangements. He was defrauded by Miss James, who willfully misrepresented herself in correspondence, leading to considerable expense and public humiliation when the deception was discovered. Garrett painted a picture of Whitmore as an innocent victim of a scheming woman who had deliberately deceived him about her appearance and character. According to his version, Delilah had practically committed theft by accepting transportation funds under false pretenses. When Blackwood rose for his opening statement, his tone was markedly different, calm, methodical, and backed by irrefutable evidence. "Your Honor, what we will prove today is that Mr. Whitmore has perpetrated a systematic fraud against vulnerable women across multiple states. Miss James is not a defendant in this case. She is the latest victim in an elaborate confidence scheme designed to extract money from women seeking honest marriage arrangements." The battle lines were drawn. For the next hour, Garrett called witnesses to testify to Whitmore's good character and reasonable expectations in a marriage arrangement. But their testimony rang hollow when Blackwood began his cross-examinations, revealing that none of them had any real knowledge of Whitmore's business practices. Then it was time for Delilah to take the stand. Walking to the witness chair felt like the longest journey of her life. Every eye in the courtroom followed her progress, and she was acutely aware of Whitmore watching from his table. But when she placed her hand on the Bible to be sworn in, her voice was steady and clear. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." Blackwood approached with encouraging smile. "Miss James, please tell the court about your correspondence with Mr. Whitmore." Delilah spoke carefully, describing the 8 months of letters that had preceded her journey west. She had been honest about her age, her widowed status, her practical skills as a seamstress. She had never claimed to be young or conventionally beautifully willing to work hard and build a life with a man who valued character over appearance. "Did you ever misrepresent your physical appearance?" Blackwood asked. "No, sir. I described myself as a woman of 43 with practical skills and a good heart. I never claimed to be anything I wasn't." "And when you met Mr. Whitmore at the train station, what happened?" Delilah's voice grew stronger as she recounted that humiliating day, the public rejection, the cruel words about her not being what was ordered, the way Whitmore had walked away without so much as a proper explanation. "How did this make you feel?" Blackwood asked, gently. "Ashamed," Delilah replied honestly. "Like I had somehow failed by being exactly who I had always said I was." But then Garrett rose for cross-examination, and the tone shifted dramatically. His questions were aggressive, designed to make Delilah appear calculating and deceptive. He suggested she had deliberately chosen flattering language to hide her obvious deficiencies. "Isn't it true, Miss James, that you knew no reasonable man would want a woman of your, shall we say, substantial proportions?" The cruel question hung in the air like poison. Around the courtroom, Delilah could see people shifting uncomfortably, some looking angry at the attorney's vicious tactics. But instead of crumbling under the attack, Delilah felt something steel inside her. She looked directly at Garrett, then at Whitmore, then at the judge. "Sir," she said clearly, "I am a woman who has worked hard all her life, who has faced loss and hardship with dignity, and who came west hoping to build a life with a man who would value those qualities. If that makes me unsuitable in Mr. Whitmore's eyes, then the failing is his, not mine." The quiet power in her response seemed to echo through the courtroom, and Delilah knew that whatever else happened, she had finally found her voice. The moment Delilah's words settled over the courtroom, the entire atmosphere shifted. Judge Harrison's expression had moved from judicial neutrality to something approaching respect, while Garrett seemed to realize his aggressive tactics had backfired spectacularly. Blackwood seized the momentum. "Miss James, after Mr. Whitmore's rejection, what happened to you?" "I was prepared to return to Philadelphia on the next train," Delilah replied. "But Mr. Eli Boone offered me shelter and the chance to think about my situation without pressure." "And has Mr. Boone treated you with respect during your time at his cabin?" "More than respect," Delilah said, her eyes finding Eli's supportive gaze. "He offered me partnership in his furniture business, valued my skills and opinions, and eventually asked me to marry him. He saw worth in me that Mr. Whitmore was incapable of recognizing." Garrett objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant, but Judge Harrison overruled him. "The witness's subsequent experiences directly bear on the plaintiff's claims about her character and desirability." "Continue, Mr. Blackwood." What followed was a methodical destruction of Whitmore's case. Martha Simmons took the stand and described her own experience, her voice growing stronger with each detail that matched Delilah's story exactly. The sworn affidavits from the other victims were read aloud, each one revealing the same pattern of deliberate rejection followed by legal intimidation. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Blackwood called Timothy Walsh, a private investigator who had been tracking Whitmore's activities across multiple states. In your investigation, Mr. Walsh, what did you discover about Mr. Whitmore's business practices? Walsh opened a thick folder and began reading from his notes. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Whitmore has initiated correspondence with at least 23 women through various mail-order bride agencies. Of those, 15 actually traveled to meet him, and all 15 were rejected within hours of arrival. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Harrison leaned forward with obvious interest. And after these rejections, what typically happened? In 12 of the 15 cases, Mr. Whitmore filed lawsuits for fraud and breach of contract. Most of the women settled out of court rather than face the expense and public humiliation of a trial. Blackwood approached the witness stand with a document. "I show you Exhibit A, Mr. Walsh. Can you identify this?" Walsh examined the paper carefully. "This is a letter from Mr. Whitmore to a business associate in Kansas City, dated 6 months ago. In it, he describes his bride business as more profitable than cattle ranching and considerably less work. The letter was devastating. In his own words, Whitmore had described exactly how the scheme worked to attract desperate women with promises of marriage, reject them for spurious reasons, then extract settlement money through legal threats. The women were too embarrassed and financially vulnerable to fight back effectively. Garrett tried desperately to discredit the evidence, claiming the letter was taken out of context, but the damage was done. When Whitmore himself finally took the stand, his testimony was a masterpiece of evasion and contradiction. "I am simply a man seeking a suitable wife," he insisted. "I have every right to reject women who do not meet my reasonable expectations." "And what exactly were those expectations?" Blackwood asked. Whitmore's answer revealed everything about his character. "A woman should be young, attractive, and grateful for the opportunity I was offering. These women were too old, too plain, too demanding." Too demanding in what way? They expected to be treated as equals rather than understanding their place. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Harrison gavelled for order, but his expression made it clear what he thought of Whitmore's attitude. Blackwood's final questions were surgical in their precision. "Mr. Whitmore, did you ever intend to actually marry any of these women? That is to say, I would have married a suitable candidate. In 3 years of searching, did you ever find a single woman you considered suitable?" Whitmore's silence was more damning than any answer could have been. When both sides rested their cases, Judge Harrison didn't even retire to deliberate. He delivered his verdict from the bench with the righteous anger of a man who had witnessed a perversion of justice. "This court finds the plaintiff's claims to be not only without merit, but part of a systematic scheme to defraud vulnerable women. The defendant's counterclaims are upheld in their entirety." The judge turned his stern gaze on Whitmore. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the federal prosecutor for potential criminal charges. What you have done, sir, is not merely civil fraud, but a cruel exploitation of women's hopes and dreams." He awarded damages to all 7 women, enough to compensate them for their travel expenses and the emotional distress they had suffered. More importantly, he issued an injunction forbidding Whitmore from engaging in any further mail-order bride arrangements. As the gavel fell with finality, Delilah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Around her, the courtroom buzzed with satisfaction and vindication. Martha Simmons reached across to squeeze her hand, tears of relief streaming down both their faces. But it was Eli's arms around her that made the victory complete. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "You did it. You all did it." Outside the courthouse, in the golden light of a Denver afternoon, Delilah finally allowed herself to believe that justice was more than just a word carved in stone above a doorway. Sometimes, when good people stood together against cruelty, it was a living force that could transform pain into purpose and shame into strength. Thomas Whitmore's reign of exploitation was over, and 7 women had reclaimed their dignity in the process. 3 months later, the mountains around Cedar Ridge were deep in winter's embrace, their peaks crowned with snow that glittered like scattered diamonds in the crystalline air. The cabin that had once been Eli's solitary refuge now hummed with the quiet contentment of two lives perfectly joined together. Delilah stood at the kitchen window, watching her husband split wood in the crisp morning air. The word husband still brought a flutter of joy to her chest, even after 6 weeks of marriage. Their wedding had been exactly what they both wanted: simple, heartfelt, and surrounded by friends who had come to understand that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. The ceremony had taken place in Cedar Ridge's small church on a snowy December morning, with Reverend Morrison performing the service and half the town in attendance. Sarah Morrison had stood as Delilah's attendant, while the blacksmith, Jonas Murphy, had served as Eli's best man. Even Mrs. Prust Abernathy had been there, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched two people who had found each other against all odds promise to love and cherish one another for the rest of their days. "Mrs. Boone," Eli had whispered as they exchanged rings, his voice filled with wonder at the reality of their union. "Mr. Boone," she had whispered back, and the simple exchange of names had felt more romantic than any flowery declaration of eternal devotion. Now, as winter deepened around their mountain home, Delilah marveled at how naturally they had settled into married life. The business they had built together continued to flourish. Word of Eli's craftsmanship had spread beyond Colorado, and orders arrived regularly from as far away as California and Texas. Delilah managed the correspondence and finances with the same skill she had once applied to her seamstress work, finding deep satisfaction in helping build something lasting and beautiful. The coffee on the stove began to bubble, drawing her attention back to the present. She poured 2 cups and was carrying them to the table when Eli stamped through the door, bringing with him the scent of pine and wood smoke. "Cold enough to freeze a man's breath this morning," he said, gratefully accepting the steaming cup. "But the sky's clear, should be a beautiful day." They had developed a morning ritual over the winter months, coffee together by the fire while they planned the day's work, and simply enjoyed each other's company. These quiet moments had become precious to Delilah, proof that contentment didn't require grand gestures or dramatic declarations. "Letter came yesterday," Eli said, retrieving an envelope from the mantel. "From Martha Simmons." Delilah's face brightened as she recognized the neat handwriting. Martha had become a regular correspondent since the trial, and their shared experience had blossomed into genuine friendship despite the miles between Kansas and Colorado. "She's getting married," Delilah announced after reading the letter, "to a school teacher in Topeka who values her mind as much as her heart. The wedding is planned for spring." "Good for her," Eli said with genuine warmth. "After what she went through, she deserves happiness." The trial had changed all of their lives in different ways. Thomas Whitmore had indeed faced criminal charges and was now serving time in federal prison for mail fraud. The story had been picked up by newspapers across the country, leading to reforms in how mail-order bride agencies operated and increased protections for women entering such arrangements. But more personally, the experience had taught Delilah something invaluable about her own worth. Standing in that courtroom, facing down Whitmore's attorney and speaking her truth without apology, had been a defining moment. She was no longer the woman who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge, broken by one man's cruel rejection. She was Delilah Boone, loved, valued, and unshakably certain of her own dignity. "Any regrets?" Eli asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. It was a question he had asked before, usually in the peaceful moments when they reflected on the unlikely path that had brought them together, and always Delilah's answer was the same. "Only that it took me so long to find you," she replied, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. They spent the morning working side by side in Eli's workshop, where a new commission awaited complezione dining set for a wealthy family in San Francisco. The work was intricate, requiring all of Eli's skill and artistry, but Delilah had learned to help with the finishing touches that made each piece special. As she carefully sanded the curved back of a chair, she thought about the letter she would write to Martha that evening. She would tell her friend about the snow that had fallen during the night, about the new orders that kept arriving despite the winter isolation, about the deep peace that came from building a life with someone who truly saw and valued you. But mostly, she would tell Martha what she had learned in the months since that terrible day at the train station, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are really the first steps toward the best things. Thomas Whitmore's rejection had felt like the end of her dreams, but it had actually been the beginning of a life more fulfilling than anything she had dared to imagine. Outside, the wind picked up, sending snow swirling around the cabin in patterns that caught the afternoon light. Soon, the winter passes would close completely, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary until spring's return. But the thought held no anxiety for Delilah only, anticipation for the quiet months ahead when she and Eli would have nothing but time to enjoy the life they had created together. As evening approached and they prepared dinner side by side in their cozy kitchen, Delilah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had left Philadelphia searching for a place to belong, and she had found something far more precious, a home, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of love that grew stronger with each passing day. The mountains stood eternal and protective around their small valley, and inside their cabin, the fire crackled with warmth and promise. This was where she belonged, not because someone had chosen her from a letter, but because she had chosen to build something beautiful with a man who understood that true worth wasn't measured in appearances, but in the depth of one's character. In the end, Thomas Whitmore had been right about one thing. She wasn't what he had ordered. She was something far better, exactly what Eli Boone had been waiting for, without even knowing it.